Leeds, Leeds, Leeds. What is happening? Welcome to Working Hours, an oral history podcast about a place called Leeds, a time called now, and an activity called work. Working Hours wants to record 1,000 loiners over the course of this, the most important decade in the history of the human species, and ask them about what they do all day and hear how they feel about it. My name is Simon, and this is all my fault. My mission here is to try to map out what my city, Leeds, a city that has declared a climate emergency, did during humanity's biggest emergency. On Working Hours, we hear how loiners have, are, and will be coping with our multiple and expanding crises during their day-to-day working hours. Can we turn things around? We'll find out. To tell this story, I need loiners like you, dear listener. I need people in Leeds or people from Leeds to come on this podcast and just tell me what they do all day and let me record how this affects us. Thank you for listening. What did you want to be when you grew up?
It's one of the things I ask my small 8-year-old children. What do you want to do? What do you want to do when you grow up on an annual basis? Every birthday I ask them. But I think I had a conscious arrival at what I wanted to do when I was probably about 5 or 6. And I really, really wanted to work with the environment. And the only career choice that I had that I could see to work with in the environment was to run a garden centre. So at the age of 6, I wanted to run a garden centre. So I started in my greenhouse at my mum and dad's. And that then developed as I kind of progressed up through school into looking at more and more green things. And then it kind of shaped into environmental things. And when I was going through the process of looking at what I could do, you choose your GCSEs, choose your A-level. The only thing that had environmental in the title at all in the whole of the university curriculum was environmental biology. So I ended up doing environmental biology at university. And then my career kind of progressed through what could you be? And it was consultancy and kind of progressing through that. But I always wanted to work in ecology, biology, and it was a really challenging field back in I'm very old, I'm in my 40s. Back in the 1990s, there wasn't very much to do with environmental or sustainability or anything like that. So my job choices were very limited as a career. But I kind of looked at ecology, did quite a lot of consultancy, environmental type thing, and then progressed into sustainability just purely by chance through my job role at the moment after being made redundant and ended up in sustainability.
So, what were you made redundant from?
So during the crash in the 2008, 2009, the first thing to go in environmental world is consultancy. Nobody wants to kind of get the additional works done. So I was an environmental consultant, which I'd been on and off for about 10 years up to that point. And so I got made redundant from the job role that I was in, and then I ended up looking for temping work, and then ended up doing sustainability with the ambulance service. So my job role is environmental and sustainability manager. And I look at everything across the board for sustainability. And it was a baptism of fire because sustainability hadn't really been formed as a job role. So I didn't really know what I was looking at and kind of stumbled into it, looking at carbon footprinting, looking at various different things and how to green an ambulance service. I was thinking, how do I start? Where do I start? What do I do? Ambulances, diesel, who knows when you need to start with that. So yeah, I was given a month's trial and I'm nearly 15 years into the job role now. So it's been something that has been a very challenging area to look at, but it's kind of developed quite a lot over the past few years.
Okay. So we kind of covered what you're doing now. So we'll go straight into, well, and we kind of touched a little bit of how you got into it as well there. Um, so maybe let's talk about that journey then, like, because obviously that's quite a big period of time from an area where there's not really those job roles to you having that job role. How much of that initially was just you going, here's a really good idea that we should do? And they went, no. And you went, okay, I'll think of another one. And it's just all these ideas, and they just went no until they went yes to one. And then, and like, how did it go?
For the current job or for.
Well, I mean, take us through that process, probably through the current job. But yeah, I mean,
So, I mean, kind of, I stumbled into this job role just purely because, as a consultant, sustainability hadn't come across my radar at all.
mm,
So, when I went for the temping jobs, I was looking at typing and looking at writing up stuff. This is back in 2009, so essentially there wasn't any structure for AI and to talk to the internet and it types everything out for you. So the kind of concept of going to a temping agency and somebody can type up all your notes and you've got a personal assistant. That's what I ended up having to do. So being made redundant, it was a go for any job role and just to get some money in. And so the temping agency said to me, do you do carbon reduction stuff? And I went, what is that? What is carbon? I don't understand. And they said, well, you do environmental stuff. Just go along for the interview. And I went, okay. Went along and they said, so we've been working with the Carbon Trust and they have a programme to look at carbon footprinting the ambulance service. And the guy who was in before has been off on long-term sick. So we need to write a report. And I went, it's trying to find a platform that works, isn't it? It's quite difficult.
yeah, well, I mean, it's so, because you can have the best internet connection, but then if someone else doesn't, or if they're in the attic room because they're trying to get away from noise and they're too far from the router, and you just hope for the best, don't you? I mean, I'm on a wireless connection here, so it could be. I don't know what anyone else is using.
Well, if it
Yeah.
rains in Moortown, I think Virgin just knocks anything out. I did an interview with the BBC for Radio 4, and they made me go and get headphones. And even then, I still sounded like I was in a tin can. And I thought, if the BBC can't get it right, then, it's going to be really difficult.
Well, that's it. It doesn't really matter about the quality. There's part of us that obsesses about quality, but we used to I mean, think of the stuff that they actually show on news phone calls and like the delayed stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
yeah. It doesn't really matter.
And the stuff I used to watch on video and VHS about the quality of that was atrocious. All right, so I'll get us back on track. I'll have another swig of drink before we start. You're listening to Series 4, Episode 28, and to my guest, Alexis Percival. This is another Squadcast interview recorded on the 18th of October, 2023. Alexis Percival is the Environmental and Sustainability Manager for Yorkshire Ambulance Service, NHS Trust, based in Yorkshire, UK. She started as the first sustainability manager for an ambulance service in the country in 2009. Her challenging role involves reducing the carbon footprint of the blue light ambulance service through innovative technologies in the estates, fleet and procurement departments. She is working on the Net Zero programme, implementing awareness schemes, rolling out a carbon champion scheme and installing innovative low-carbon technologies across the estate. She has worked on the development of low to zero emission ambulances with innovative low-carbon fleet technologies, as well as facilitating the rollout of the EV charging infrastructure for the ambulance service, working with the civic and other healthcare partners to ensure additional infrastructure is implemented to support the service. Alexis is also investigating the challenges of decarbonising the ambulance service through renewable technologies, net zero ambulance station design, phasing out of N2 NOx, and looking at the alternative models of care. She is also working to prepare the ambulance service for climate adaptation, assessing the impact of flooding, heat waves, and sea inundation on the service. Alexis also set up the GREAN, that's GREAN, Green Environmental Ambulance Network in 2010, connecting all of the sustainability leads across the ambulance service of the UK to drive forward the net zero agenda. Alexis has over 25 years of experience in the environmental field as an environmental consultant working on large national and international projects in the UK, as well as Brazil, Germany, Mozambique, and Australia. She even managed to fit in a career break and spent 3 years driving around the world in an ex-military ambulance, travelling overland to Australia and then travelling around South America. You can contact her at alexis.percival@nhs.com or follow her on the platform formerly known as Twitter, twitter.com/Alexis Keech. That's Keech. Right, let's do this, episode 108 of Working Hours with Alexis Percival. So, yeah, if you take us through how much kind of resistance and how much acceptance. I mean, obviously you started telling the story about, so we got as far as the agency and then them telling you about the Carbon Trust job. Yes. And you were like, what's carbon?
Okay, so yeah, the temping agency had looked at my CV and said, oh, you do environmental things, don't you? And so they basically said, well, why don't you go and have a bit of an interview with Yorkshire Ambulance Service? So I went along and they said, well, you know, we're looking for somebody to look at carbon footprinting and looking at environmental stuff. And I went, I could do the environmental stuff, but carbon footprinting, I've never done that before. They said, don't worry about it. There's loads of stuff from the Carbon Trust, and you just have there's a spreadsheet. You just fill it in. You got about a month to write a report. And I went, okay. So in the space of a month, I literally learned everything from scratch about the Climate Change Act, what we needed to do in order to get the whole of the environmental agenda in place, write a report and do the full carbon footprinting with about 10 years worth of data to kind of assess in order to look at it. Mm-hmm. So it was a baptism of fire in an industry that I had never even looked at before. And to be honest, it was a really interesting process. And then I got to the end of the month and I went, do you want me to carry on doing this? They said, oh, yeah, that's fine. And I said, well, what do I do after that? You know, is this carbon footprinting thing, you know, looking at zero emissions, is that going to be a thing? And my boss went, I think you're always going to have a job. Don't worry. So that was nearly 15 years ago. And I'm still in the job. And it is one of the most challenging jobs that you could have, I think, basically because you've got to deal with healthcare, you've got to deal with environmental agendas, legislation, governments and their political viewpoints on things, the net zero agenda, climate change, adaptation, how we work towards a world that is going to be very different tomorrow. Literally, you know, at this present moment in time, I'm watching the weather warnings for Storm Babbitt coming in, and how much of an impact that's going to have here in Yorkshire, but also nationally, and then how those things will affect everything around the rest of the country. As an emergency service, how do we deal with that on a response? How do we drive through floodwaters or not drive through floodwaters? How do we deal with rescuing patients, dealing with hospitals potentially that might be flooded, but also longer term, how we're looking at heat waves.
Supplies as well.
Yeah. And how do we look at the supply chain, as you quite rightly say. So there's stuff that's dealing with the here and now and trying to reduce carbon emissions, but the longer term aspect of what we need to do in order to adapt to the inevitable and also the possible. Because if we screw this up, we are quite knackered. So we need to factor in all of those as a short-term, medium-term, and quite a long-term trajectory to look at what we need to do to adapt to the inevitable and the not quite written as yet. But as a healthcare system, we're going to be scraping people up from every scenario. So we need to work through everything that we need to do to look at that.
Okay, so this is the first question I thought of before we get into everything else. There's a lot there. Do you regret wanting to go into an environmental field now?
That's a big one. I
Just in terms of like, I mean, that is in no way how you would have imagined that
no.
job. So say you wanted a garden centre and now you're like reading government policy, like, dealing with all sorts of like considering global supply chains.
It's a massive piece of work, and as my boss said at the time, you will always be in a job. And uh, within the sustainability field, we 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 we're really perplexed as to why there aren't more people in this field, because this is the only game in town. We basically are looking at, I'm not being a doomer here, but we are looking at planetary extinction. And we need to understand how we can work to mitigate that. And it's not just sustainability, it's across the board. We all need to be looking at it on a personal level. So, how do you deal with your power cuts, podcasts going off? How do we deal with understanding where our food comes from and growing it on our own doorsteps? Up to the how do we, as a health system, deal with supply chains that could be cut off immediately, because China might decide to close the doors and we're getting zero face masks, zero medicines, and zero systems that support and run our own systems. But also at the same time, we need to understand how, as a society, we kind of work and function. So we can see through various different wars that are going on around the world how much of an impact those little tiny things that might be a long way away from us, but they can disrupt the whole of our digital systems. They can disrupt our fleet systems, our supply chains, just by shutting their borders or blowing up a factory. But when we start to look at the impact of climate change, that's really far-reaching, because that's everything across the planet. And COVID highlighted some of those challenges, and how much of an impact those had was just a short period of time. But if you've got those factories, those systems permanently underwater, hit by cyclones, hit by typhoons, hit by migration, and nobody's there to actually work in those factory systems, how do we deal with that? And it's not a collapse system. It is real, and it happens on a regular basis. If we start to look at things like how India was underwater last year, there is a huge impact that lasts for a really long time. But also those impacts are having a ripple effect. So people don't want to live in floodplains, strangely. So those people move to higher land, and that pushes the migration out. And we're starting to see migration impacts across the world. People are moving, and they're moving with justified. There's nothing there for them, or they're in threat, whether it's through drought, whether it's through flooding, whether it's through heat waves. Nobody wants to live in 50 degrees. Nobody wants to live in floodplains. Nobody wants to live in areas that their grandparents might be dying through heat waves, which come sporadically. So we need to understand that, but also within the NHS, we need to understand how much of an impact that can have on us in our own sphere within the UK. So to go back to your original question, did I really want to get into this field? Retrospectively, yes, I think I did. It's just I didn't realise how big it would be, and how much it weighs heavily on me, how much a responsibility I have for just my little field, but also how much of an impact so few of us have to have in order to achieve net zero in such a short space of time. It is a really, really big task for such a few of us to kind of achieve.
Mm. So, well, I'm not going to do the. I'm thinking as well. It might be worth us turning the video off, for a better connection.
Yeah.
But you can still hear me.
The storm is coming in.
Yes, this is true. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, climate change is a part of this city, this podcast, um, and there's a question on it there. I think it's going to be one of those where everything's kind of going to be a bit bundled together here because I mean, it all is because that's your job. It's dealing with the whole world, but also a small area. Um, so, where do I want to go with this? Okay, so what were the kind of things that's a huge thing to deal with, and as you realize the complexity and the size, the scale of what you were dealing with, like dealing with being overwhelmed or with too much information, or being able to put that into a framework within your head that you can maybe compartmentalize it, or like how do you live a life and then do that and try and tell everyone to change, but also look at all the things that you're looking at.
It's a massive responsibility, and I think anybody who works in the environmental and climate change or sustainability field suffers, and it comes in waves of climate anxiety. I've reached the point of full climate anxiety now. Um, I think I was extremely optimistic with all the various COPs there have been, and COP26 highlighted a lot of the opportunity that we've got and the issues and challenges that we've got. But it didn't, the kind of weight of this agenda really didn't hit me until I was involved with the Met Office. So the Met Office does on a 5-year cycle, they do a climate projection assessment. So I got invited to join the UK CP18, which is the UK Climate Projection 2018 agenda, and I was one of only 2 representatives of the whole of the NHS, which is quite alarming because there's 1.5 million people that work in the NHS. So to me, I was thinking, well, there needs to be a few more of us here because healthcare and health agenda is the core of, of climate change and the whole of the climate agenda, essentially. So they'd been working on the project, kind of looking at lots of different things. They'd got the Met Office supercomputer to do the analysis, lots of stakeholder engagement, blah, 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 all that type of stuff. And after 2 years of kind of going through all the stuff, the UK CP18 agenda was launched, and they had a big meeting in London. And it was extremely exciting because it was like, oh, this is going to be amazing. They're going to tell us what we're looking towards and the kind of climate projections and what's going to hit us. And they've taken everything down to the whole of the UK down to a 10 kilometre square. So you could actually see in a 10 kilometre square what would affect you, down to a 5 kilometre square, and then in cities looking at a 1 kilometre square. So you could look at this super computer data to say, okay, what is 2020 is going to look like, and 2040 and 2050 and all the way up to 2100. And they presented the data, really exciting data. And I sat there, and it didn't hit me until I got back on the train back up to Leeds. So I was sitting in King's Cross, and I basically burst into tears and went, this is really horrendous. We are looking at 2,100, a 1 to 3 metre sea level rise. So I looked at the Yorkshire region and went, wow, that's the whole of the Humber, taking out all of the towns all the way up to Selby. That's the whole of Hull under sea level, under the underwater. That's most of our coastal towns gone by the end of this century. And in fact, they said, well, do you know, it's already baked in. And being the Met Office, they're very matter of fact. They said it's already baked in that we will be having sea level rise up to 13 metres by 2300 with the stuff, the glacier melt that we've already got. So you look at 13 metre sea level rise, and we're getting close to Leeds by sea. It's pretty dire. I mean, it's not in our lifetime, but it's certainly our great grandchildren's lifetimes. So it was a pretty dire situation, and I had two very small children at the time, and I'm thinking, what have I just brought them into? That this is not a world that they are going to enjoy. Basically, this is we've gone past the period of frivolity and excitement. This is really, really horrendous horizon that we're looking at. So when we start to look at the things and the experiences that you kind of lead you through, that was my kind of pivotal. How do I deal with this? And since then, I've gone through many ups and downs of climate anxiety and kind of panic attacks and 4 a.m. wake ups. But also at the same time, you have to reach an equilibrium within yourself to get past the depression, because otherwise it's immobilizing. Because it's a bit like the Greenpeace campaign of the 1980s, where we are the slow boiling frog, and many are not quite seeing what we need to see in order to understand what we need to adapt to and what we need to change to. It's a really, really difficult scenario to be in. Within the NHS, there's only about 300 or 400 of us that work in sustainability as our core jobs. And every single one of us now, I think, is going through the ranks of those climate waves that we go through. So you get to the peak of, I've achieved something amazing, and then suddenly you'll have a heat wave, a flooding incident. All the scenarios have hit us this year, and it's huge. There's so many different things that have happened that we don't see in the mainstream media, because well, it's just normal now. But is it normal for displacement of 1 million people in India? Is it normal for floods to happen? Is it normal for droughts to occur that basically move millions of people around the world because there is no water? Is it normal for the US and Mexico to be having a start of a potential war over the river that Mexico desperately needs the water for? You won't have seen any of this, but it's there. It's there in the media if you look for it. And so for us that are aware of the climate crisis and what we need to be doing and acting on, it's a pretty hefty burden, and we need as many people to get engaged in this agenda to kind of move it forwards. Stop bringing me down, man.
But that's the thing. But you know, there is the move. I mean, you've obviously had to spend a lot of your time, because obviously you know, you're presenting all this to management, like you're processing and churning information for the machine, you know. So, but you're also trying to push things forward, trying to get things changed, and trying to actually achieve something. You know, like you didn't stay with the job just to write reports and read horrific horror stories. Like, so how do you? I mean, there must be something in that in terms of like the way you frame it, the way you think about it, and the way that. I don't know. And there's a continuity between, you know, obviously this is a problem that doesn't finish when you stop working. So I suppose the question here is about the kind of work-life balance. Can you kind of put any of that into work mode? Is the work giving you, like, do you feel like you're doing something? Do you feel like you're actively pushing things forward? But I mean, I just imagine that you would feel worse if you weren't in the job that you're in and you knew what you knew.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I don't have an off button. So over the years, I've run various different events, working with lots of amazing people in and around Leeds, and regionally and nationally, and also internationally, to look at how we can drive this agenda forward. So I've done evening events with Green Drinks Leeds. I work with around the Environmental Action Project. I look at what we could do for rewilding various different spaces. And we've got some amazing people that are doing fantastic things across Leeds. And we've also got lots of action groups and lots of dynamic people that we can help drive this forwards, many who volunteer their own time. So I'm part of that network of fantastic people that are driving stuff forwards, because it's a transition and everybody can do their bit. But as I said, that there is no off button. We basically are in a state that we have to donate our time to kind of help educate other people. So I run carbon literacy courses. I look at what we could do at various different farmers markets and talk to people about various different bits of the agenda. We can look at tree planting programs. And it's really difficult to kind of disconnect it, because it's as I said, 5-6 issues at the core of me, addressing the kind of inequalities of what the environmental world brings to us, the benefits of it. And I think we all had that understanding of how much the environment impacts us during COVID, because that 1 hour that we were allowed out, you wanted to go to a green space. You didn't want to stay within the plain concrete walls. We wanted to get outside and experience the outside green spaces without cars, without the kind of air pollution. And we could hear the birds, we could see the bees, we could understand what was going on. And it really, it's part of that process for me is if I battle with the bureaucracy internally, which, the NHS is quite a bureaucratic organisation at the best of times, because we spend public money, but we have to spend it correctly. And it's part of the challenge that we have, but it can tie you up sometimes.
And you're also dealing with people's lives. It's not like, customer service or your fashion or anything.
Yeah, exactly. So it presents us with quite a lot of opportunities as barriers, as well as barriers to kind of progress things forwards. So sometimes projects can take a really long time, really, really long time. And I think that's part of the challenge of my job, is that we don't have the money. We don't have in many cases, we don't have the expertise. We don't have the knowledge. So we have to go through the process of getting that. So it can become very frustrating sometimes. And projects can turn from what should be a week to 2 weeks of kind of implementing it if you're in the private sector, to maybe a couple of years in order to implement stuff. So I turn my frustration to the externals situations, and that's where the off switch doesn't come, because I want to make an impact somewhere. So we're looking to plant orchards across North Leeds at the moment, with various different environmental groups that I work with. There's lots of education programs that we're looking at, growing spaces. There's so many different opportunities that step outside of the realms of the day job, but also mean that you can connect into your local networks and local communities to look at how we move things forwards. And although a lot of people may not think it's climate change, it is, because we need cohesion in order to be a connected society going forwards, because otherwise it will all fall apart very, very quickly. And what's seen in non-cohesive societies is you end up with neighbours that die in heat waves. You end up with communities that collapse in flooding events because they're not there to support each other. So a lot of this stuff, it helps alleviate some of the climate anxiety, and also because I can actually get some action, get some things in place, trees growing, whatever it might be. So there's lots of involvement in lots of different groups. So there is no off switch when it comes to climate change.
You must think that every win is a win to a degree.
Absolutely.
But do you get to feel that a lot?
Yes.
Good.
And not as much as I want at work, but at the same time, as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that we do need to have progress forwards in different ways, but every win is a win, and sometimes that win can take a really long time, unfortunately. But I think a lot of the transition, and this will date this podcast. So today, Greta Thunberg got arrested, and one of the challenges is if you have leading people like that, it shows that we're getting into the psyche of system change. But unfortunately, we still need to have that battle in order to get to that point of the system being changed.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the stuff that it's boundary pushing when it comes to sustainability and climate change, because people don't want to change, because that's we've had the amazing kind of lives that we've had up to date, and everybody wants to carry on flying. Everybody wants to move around. They want to get in their car. They want to be able to do everything. That can still happen, but it will be in a different format. So there's lots of different things that we need to change in order to get to a net zero future. So those wins are part of the process of changing how we function, how we work as a society to kind of move things forward.
Okay, so we've touched upon COVID, and I want to kind of touch upon it, but obviously if it's very brutal and you don't want to go too much into it, you can kind of move around it however you want to navigate around it. But I think it'd be interesting, because what I'm thinking there is, we have had a massive system change in recent memory, in all our recent memory, even though a lot of us are forcing it out of our memory. We were able to change the world overnight, switch everything off, quite literally. And as you say, there were benefits from that. There was also lots of terrible outcomes that we're dealing with. But yeah, so did COVID change your work, your approach to the work? Did it just accelerate things, or did it send you off in another direction? Because COVID kind of came at a time when climate-wise there was quite a big build-up in the news of, obviously America was on fire, Australia was on fire. There was that big, huge fire in the bush where there was all the koalas being saved, and that was big news for a bit. So what was kind of the impact and the changes to your work from COVID?
We had a massive movement and a massive shift change that happened with the Fridays for Futures work, all of the stuff that happened with Greta Thunberg, and we had a real wave that we were riding on, and that was 2019, a bit of 2018, and there was a bit of a system change. Within the NHS, we had a real push to see if we could declare a climate emergency and how we could drive that one forwards, understanding the challenge that climate change, the climate crisis is essentially a health crisis. The two are intrinsically linked. So March 23rd, 2020, most of those that could were thrown out of the NHS and told to go work from home. And everybody, all the heroes that were left in were the ones that were kind of battling to kind of drive COVID out of our hospital doors, essentially. It was, for me, COVID basically shifted me to having a higher energy bill, working from home. And I still haven't gone back to the office. But it highlighted so many different challenges within the health system. So instantly we had the scale of the problem for our PPE, which I think a lot of people understood very quickly how fragile our supply chains are within society, but within the NHS we were even more fragile. So normally, just as an example, normally our ambulance service used around 20,000 face masks a year. So within the first 3 months of COVID happening, we used 1.3 million face masks. And the scale of the problem and the waste and everything that went with that, it just, for anybody working in sustainability, it was a hair pulling moment, just going, oh my
Yeah.
God, how do we get through this? Because we had hospitals that were being threatened with being closed down. We had ambulance stations that the bins were overflowing. And there was major problems with our waste suppliers being able to actually deal with the waste, because it had gone from next to
Mm.
nothing to absolute inundation, rivers of PPE. But
Mm-hmm.
also we had more and more coming into the system, and we had so much stuff that we understood our supply chains are fragile, but also our waste system's fragile, but also the
Mm.
people working in the system are really, really susceptible. And we needed to understand
Mm.
all of those things. So at the time, I'd had an amazing program that was coming. So lots of carbon reduction programs, looking at stuff. I was looking to get carbon literacy project involved, and we were having
Mm-hmm.
carbon conversations. How can we get to reduce our carbon emissions? And then suddenly, on the 1st of October in 2020, the Greener NHS was launched, and the Greener NHS is what the previous organisation, which is the Sustainable Development Unit, they basically came in and said, right, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions, but we're going to do it earlier. And we're going to get to net zero by 2040 for all of our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is basically everything that we generate as an NHS.
Mm-hmm.
And we want everybody else, all our supply chain, to achieve net zero by 2045. And all of us in sustainability went, oh my God, this is amazing. How have we
Mm.
managed to achieve this? But it re-changed everything. So this is mid-COVID. And so we also had piles of waste. We had the piles of PPE challenges. We had our supply chain challenges. And I'm in the middle of this, was going, well, how do I tackle some of these things? How do I deal with some of these projects? So I set up a test bed for reusable face masks, of which, same standard as a single-use plastic one that lasts for 400 years, a reusable
Mm-hmm.
cloth one that has got the same qualities. And we worked with about 5 or 6 different suppliers, and it went
Mm-hmm.
from just the face mask manufacturers, face mask users in Leeds. So we were working with the university, working with Leeds Teaching Hospital, and it went from about 3 or 4 of us kind of saying, well, can we test these? Maybe not on front line, but let's work at people behind the scenes. And it went
Mm.
escalated dramatically because everybody was going, I cannot cope with the amount of waste. And we basically said, let's increase this dramatically, and let's get up to, there was nearly 70 organisations that decided to buy into it. We tracked, because of COVID, they were tracking the kind of amount of face masks that were being used. And in the time period we were testing our face masks, which ran for about a year and a half, the NHS churned through over 8 billion face masks. Normally, it'd be less than 20 million.
Mm.
So you can see from just a single-use face mask how much volume of waste just from one product, and everything else was escalated. So we're looking at aprons, looking at gowns, looking at the theatre caps, everything that was single-use. So COVID for me
And
was
most of it being shipped around the world.
exactly, and that was the other thing. We've still got a lot in containers in container yards that are going out of date. But for me, I kind of, it highlighted the fragility of what we've got, and how we need to have stuff in the UK manufactured
Yeah.
by ourselves, but also we need to look at reuse. And we could have dramatically reduced the amount of face masks, just as an example, just by having reusables, and they could be used 40 to 100 times, these face masks. So
Mm-hmm.
but the challenges are, it was quite a lot of bureaucracy, and those systems have now changed. So working with organisations like the MHRA and the Health and Safety Executive, those systems can be changed, but there needs to be legislation changes. So I'm now working with European Union, who design and write the environmental the environmental law, the ISO standards, the SEN standards, to look at what we can do to change those through law and have reusables, because historically reusables are not featuring in any of the documentation. So again, that's a prolonged period. So the win will come out of that, but it will be maybe a year or two away. But that will mean that we can have reusable items as a healthcare, respiratory, or a cleaning product, or whatever it might be. But we've changed the standard so that can actually happen. But
It's worth the time investment though for
it
that.
is,
I mean,
yeah,
it's like a big multiplier.
yeah. Well, this is not going to be the first, and it won't be the last, unfortunately, of our pandemics. So if we can get this right now, we can understand how it will impact us going forward.
Other than working from home, has it changed how you work? I mean, I suppose it can be considered not a massive change working from home, but it is a pretty significant change. I mean, how connected with colleagues were you? You know, being in that particular field, were you kind of the person who just did stuff on their own because nobody was like, you know, Alexis is doing sustainability stuff. I don't know what that is.
Yes, you've got it very succinctly there. Yeah. I think for me, it revolutionised communication. So the environmental agenda ramped up rapidly just purely because of online stuff. So overnight, we went from tinkering with, can we work Skype? What's Zoom? Could we?
Yeah,
Well,
can we
we need
stop
to.
having all these meetings that need to be loads
And
of transport everywhere?
exactly, and literally, on March 23rd, March 24th, they'd switched on Teams. Were working with Zoom, and my IT team said, John, we've moved forward 7 years overnight just purely because we've had to. And
Yeah.
everybody stumbled through what we needed to do, and we're all getting a little bit better at Teams, unmute yourself. It's something that we all kind of challenge ourselves to kind of look at and do presentations and all the rest. But for me, it completely revolutionized how we communicate climate change, because your audience is huge. So I ran quite a lot of webinars to educate people about various different agendas and the lead up to COP26. And we were getting 100 to 150 people across the whole of the NHS coming and joining just within the Yorkshire region. But more were saying, oh, I really want to watch that. How can we record it? So it had a much bigger reach outside of the realms of who you normally talk to. Because normally there'd be a closed meeting with 3 or 4 of you in a super
Yeah.
air-conditioned room and everybody
Yeah.
freezing. And then you'd all driven there. But literally,
Yeah.
that
I'll be drinking bottled
changed.
water that came with the room.
Yes, exactly. So it literally was a kind of a revolution on lots of different aspects. But also it allowed access to a lot of technologies and things online that we hadn't had. So a lot of the SharePoint stuff came online. A lot of the Teams stuff, collaboration online, all of those things changed the way we could educate each other, but also how we communicated with each other. And you could have very different conversations. We all know the conversations aren't as good as having those water cooler conversations, but at the same time, it changed how we talk to people, who we talk to people, and it pushed the climate change agenda rapidly up the agenda for so many different groups that wouldn't normally have been engaged with it.
Well, and it opens like you say, with webinars and stuff where people can just join. And, you know, if they've got 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever, and, you know, they've got a bit of downtime, maybe even do it on their break. It's like, it's so much more accessible to them. And all it takes is just, you know, if someone's just a bit curious, they pop in and then perhaps they're sent off on their own journey, or, you know, it's just giving someone else a bit more confidence and a bit more information. I mean, I was thinking it as well to the social media question, because part of that is, I mean, sometimes I look at things like Slack and so on, because although, you know, when I'm asking about social media, we generally think of social media as the kind of Facebook and Twitter as the collapsing platforms, um,
Yeah.
rather than, you know, all of these things that became far more widespread, things that that developers and stuff have been using for a while, but like Teams, Skype, Trello, all of these kind of things. But yeah, do you have to do any kind of traditional sort of posting and so on in your role, or is it more just internally focused and you're not trying to sort of especially do anything online and have a presence and build a brand?
I have to do all the social media stuff. So the communications aspect, I'm a team of one. So it's literally the team is me and I am the team, and it's a very difficult thing. But it does mean you communicate in a very different way. So I can do a staff update newsletter on a monthly basis. I do quite a lot of Twitter stuff, and the communication aspect fits into different realms of different groups. But we also have like the social networks that we have within sustainability. So communicating with groups across the region, nationally, there's lots of different elements that we have. So it's something that social media itself has kind of morphed since COVID into lots of different spheres and lots of different platforms for different people. But it does mean that you can reach people, different psyches. Some people are engaged, some people are not. Post-it notes are always a good one in a normal meeting, and suddenly you can get some engagement with that. But it's very difficult, I think, with social media, because you do end up shouting into the void sometimes, and you don't know if anybody's actually listening.
Yeah, and then you convince yourself that nobody is, and then someone turns up and says, "Oh, I heard that thing." If you, it's like, "Oh God, someone heard that."
Somebody says, "Would you like to do a podcast with working out?" Yeah.
So let's do. We're doing climate change and social media. Let's do Brexit, and then we move into the kind of more fun questions. I don't know. I mean, obviously, across the ambulance service and supplies and so on, I imagine there's going to be an impact. Like, how has Brexit changed your work, and if so, how?
So in the NHS, it was not called Brexit. It was called EU exit. So there was a lot of risk assessments that went on to look at the whole supply chain, where things were coming from, and then also our suppliers' supply chain to assess that. So the NHS was quite ready for Brexit, EU exit, and they were very conscious of what challenges there might be. It didn't have a direct impact because they'd kind of planned quite a bit, but I think a lot of the legislation of Europe and some of the cost implications have had an impact. So on my job role, no, it hasn't really. But for the ambulance service and the NHS as a whole, it has had an impact, and things that have happened in Europe, for example, with Ukraine war, we had to do a lot of risk assessments, and then Russia decided to pull the plug on gas supplies, and we had to do a lot of assessments to look at how that impacted our own gas supplies, which it did. So there is a lot of things that the European connections are still there, but we need to kind of assess things. And with having a fairly sizable fleet, we need to assess the impact of different supply chains for our fleet, which has had a direct impact since Brexit. But for me in my own job role, no, it hasn't directly affected me, but it has made me look at the supply chain and the impacts upstream.
Yeah, I was again. I'm thinking as you sort of saying that the change is kind of the type of information that you're looking at. That's been your Brexit change. It's like,
Yeah.
oh well, now I have to look at different reports. Like, so it's kind of the same, except the reports have different things on them. So yeah, I think I'm done with Brexit, unless you want to add anything else on that.
No, I mean, it's not really. It affected us, but not really affected us as such, because I think there was a lot of planning that went into it.
So let's do the change question. I think this will be really interesting. So, if you could change any three things about your work, what would you change? And you can be as realistic or unrealistic as you want with this. Maybe you can do both. Maybe you could do like a perfect three, like your ideal, like these would be the three that would be amazing. And then the three kind of more pragmatic, like maybe achievable ones. Up
Okay,
to you, or you can mix them up. But I'll
let's
let
go
you have
unrealistic.
6 here.
Yeah. We'll go in unrealistic. So the NHS is completely funded to decarbonise everything. So there's lots of money available. So that's number one. Number two, the NHS achieves net zero, which it could be possible, but I very much doubt it. And also number three, we can get a hydrogen electric ambulance on the road by the end of by 2030. That'd be amazing. So realistic, it would be nice to have some money, any money, to kind of transition our NHS of any sort and healthcare systems over to greener fuels, greener infrastructure, and achieve something, and make sure we can get there. Number two, on the slightly more realistic list, it would be great to have a bit less bureaucracy and kind of looking at what we could do. And I think a lot of the legislation we've got coming will help with quite a lot of those changes. Having some funding would also help with the changes. And number three, there is a viable option that we might have a zero emission ambulance, which within Leeds we are likely to have 2 electric ambulances this year. But having one that is functional, that can work in and around the Yorkshire region, we're probably looking at, as a full-blown frontline ambulance, we're probably looking at 2035 as some viable options. So these things are achievable. It's just they're maybe not at the timeframes that I need and want them to happen in.
Okay, we'll put a pin in that. So I'm going to move on to UBI, Universal Basic Income. So I know you're aware of this. Do you think it would change anything for your role in the first instance to consider this? Like, and if it would change anything, how do you think it might change your role? Would you do less hours, or would you be spending more on planting more forests, or like how would it change things for you?
I think it would be an amazing situation for everyone in the entire UK. It would give that basic cost of living benefit. I think for me personally, I mean, I work in the NHS and everything is, we do have pay rises on an annual basis, maybe not in line with where they need to be, but it would probably, for me, it would enable me to kind of look at that extra day, maybe a week or a month, to kind of do the stuff that really matters, the stuff outside, and do something that's a bit heartwarming and a bit brain cleansing, to get out there, plant some trees, do the stuff we need, maybe do some community work, and it would enable quite a lot of the stuff that needs to happen. I think would be really, it would be quite beneficial to communities to have that in place.
Is the real climate work sort of planting and people rather than papers and policy?
The resilience is. I think that the challenge is that the policy is where the action happens. So as we've seen with various political changes and changes in direction recently, it's had a direct impact on my work, because my timeframes have extended rather than being squashed, which is not what I need and not what I want. So the policy, but the rebellion comes from those policies changing. In reality, when we start to look at the recent announcement of EV charging stuff, nothing's changed at all. The legislation states that all electric vehicle manufacturers, all vehicle manufacturers, period, have to have an electric vehicle strategy, and by this date, which is 2030, they all have to have only electric vehicles for sale. So in reality, it's going to happen. It'd be the same time frame.
Yeah.
It's just it's word weaseling as such, to look at how you can win votes and things. But the problem is the kind of hearts and minds of the population will be swayed by whatever is within their political persuasions, their community persuasions, or whatever it might be. So the support, and as we were talking about social media, the social media impact can have a dramatic impact on climate change viewpoints. So we all know there's an awful lot of trolls that are around online, and they can sway people's vision of stuff. So a lot of the climate advocacy and the climate work, as you quite rightly say, it's about people, and it's about building their own resilience so that they are knowledgeable about stuff, they can have behavioural change in place, and also that they're ready for stuff. So the resilience is built into the communities.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the Magnificent Seven now for some
bit of dumb busting.
Everyone getting ready for what's coming. So I think in terms of going back to achievable and unachievable kind of thing, and the playing of politics, I mean, do you see any kind of scenario where, I mean, obviously if there's a famine in England, for example, that will necessitate some political change. I would hope or imagine. I mean, it would, because I mean, as much as they didn't want to act on the virus, ultimately action had to be taken, and whatever you want to believe about why the action had to be taken and was taken. Do you think what we see over the kind of coming years will start to force it, beyond the political kind of hopes and ideals? Because I've said a couple of times on the podcast, and that, I've heard other people kind of reiterate, I think, it will be more likely the right that does things than so-called left parties, because they're generally more in power, but also it's kind of easier for them to do sometimes, because they're just like, we're doing this. Whereas if you're doing it from the other side, it's a bit more like, oh, why are you doing that? And it's terrible, and it's all, everyone's just wearing jumpers and eating beans or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, does it feel like a cool phase at the moment? Do you feel like, has it got harder again?
Well, I mean, I think the problem is you're only as good as the last disaster that is reported. Right. And since the media in the UK doesn't report, if you go through the BBC or ITV, they generally don't have climate change items that are every day. I mean, Scotland had 150 millimetres of rain 2 weeks ago, and there was so much flooding, and it didn't even feature on the national news.
Yeah.
And with storms that are coming in, what will be quite a frequent occasion over the next few months, it will be a hard push to even see those, because it's just become the norm. So last year we had a heat wave hit 43 degrees. We had the hottest summer. We had 3,500 people that died early, and lots of people hospitalised, and lots of people suffering with the heat and the heat stroke that went with it. But the reality is, everybody's forgotten. That was last year. It hasn't
Hmm.
happened this year. What a rubbish summer. Oh, it's dreadful. So it is really
It's
difficult
been loads of hot days this summer as well, and
mm,
just recently in October. In fact, I was only just recently saying, like, I actually feel a bit more normal that it's got cold now,
yeah,
or a bit colder. Um, like people can say it's nice as much as they want, but I still think there's a psychological thing there of like they know it's that the switches in the brains going, this isn't right.
yeah. You're right. I mean, we shouldn't be having the temperatures that we had at the beginning of October and September.
Mm.
A wet summer is fairly normal in the UK, but when you
It
look
was
at the longer,
15 degrees at night in
exactly,
October.
I know,
15 at night. Not
and
like
we still
okay, it's
have
exception.
all the insects flying around. We have
Yeah,
butterflies flitting around.
yeah,
Everything should be hibernating, and everything
yeah,
should have. All the leaves are still on the tree.
yeah.
Again, another kind of indication. We've got people's apple trees are in flower, and
Mm,
that's not normal. But
mm.
the problem is it's those little tiny things that most people don't notice. Whereas a heat wave or it's 40 odd degrees, they do notice. But
Mm.
I don't think many of them remember it because it didn't
No, it's
happen.
always seen as exceptional.
Yeah, it's the
Like even though
unprecedented.
it's happened every year or every week, every like if it went on for 3 weeks, they'd be like, oh, and then there'd be a week of cool, and then everyone would forget. It's like, oh, this summer's been terrible, hasn't it? It's like you've just had three of the hottest weeks ever.
Yeah, yeah, it's not right at all. um, and I think that's the problem. It will take something that's quite a prolonged thing,
Mm,
like as you say, like a famine. I mean, many will probably remember the flooding that we had, the Boxing Day flooding,
hmm,
and how that affected Leeds. But
mm,
also was the flooding in Fish Lake down in Sheffield. But what didn't really get reported is our breadbasket of the north, Lincolnshire, had
mm,
3 or 4 months of being underwater.
mm,
So all those that fruit and vegetables that grown there
mm,
didn't grow at all because it was the wrong season and basically everything was sodden. All the earthworms died,
mm,
and we had a major problem. Um, but the thing is that was scooped up with everything else that happened. Yeah, who cares? We can go and import lettuces from Spain or southern France or wherever it might be.
mm,
So it didn't become a problem. But the thing is we do need to acknowledge that Spain has had flooding this week. Last week they
mm.
had 40-degree temperatures.
Yeah, it's been on
These things are
fire
going
all
to
year.
affect our extended food basket.
Yeah.
So the famine is coming at some point, and we will suffer a prolonged period of drought that will affect all of our flood, our ecosystems and food systems. The River Po last year had no water in, and that runs the entire length of Italy's breadbasket. So
Mm,
all of the food coming from there couldn't grow because they couldn't water anything,
mm,
and they ended up with major problems with their soil systems being with salt inundation from the sea because they were pumping so
mm-hmm,
much out. So there's a lot of different things that will come, but it will take that big event to be a big problem, like the Great Dust Bowl of America, like a lot of different prolonged periods, and it may take a couple of growing seasons or a couple of years of heat waves that kill off hundreds of thousands of people in Europe for it to actually sink in for some people. Others, we get it, we understand what we need to do, but there's lots of different things that we need to tackle. That is from planting trees to cool our housing to look at solar systems and more of a combined smart microgrids between us all. So we're sharing our electricity. We're not relying on the grid to connect in. Looking
mm,
at how we preserve our water so we can grow our own food in our own back gardens, or kind of work with community systems to have that. And it is, as we were saying earlier, it's about having those systems between us all as a community and supporting each other, because it will get hard at some point and we need to work out how we can kind of support that community spirit, a bit of a blitz system that we need to look at. But how we get there, we need to start connecting a bit more.
Yeah.
Existential thinking.
But I'm also thinking about the. So, I mean, there's a clear climate element to this podcast, and obviously with work, part of work is the things that make work good work are meaning, purpose, mastery. From what I've read. Do you think that is there something more ideal in the kind of toil and the tolling against the climate misery and building something and like very kind of earthy and 20th century kind of work gloriness in the work that will be needed to be done for climate over sitting in offices, writing reports, sending emails, doing posts and stuff? Like, would we be happier in a more miserable society? I guess I'm asking there. Like, I mean, because there are health benefits. Like a lot of people, again with lockdown, people sort of we're going back to this, that, and the other. But I think as well there's a lot of skills gaps because our idea of the world is very much media constructed. So everything's kind of these representational icons. Like you must identify with this from the work that you've been doing where you just spent years connecting everything and looking at complexity and nuance and variables. But generally the way that we can communicate is like, a graphic of an avatar in some kind of stereotypical national dress of like, this is there and that's there. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I suppose. All right, let me try and phrase it like this. What if you weren't doing this, and the world was kind of working on the climate problem? What do you think your role would be in that? Would it be all cottagecore, or would it be kind of a rewilded Leeds, or would there be a big dome over the like? How do you imagine your kind of best case scenario? Do you want to be sitting in an office more, or do you want to be doing stuff more? I guess
I have a lot of pleasure from creating stuff that helps the world. That sounds a big thing, but I've planted a forest up in at our headquarters, one of our emergency operations centres up in York. Mm-hmm. And 2,500 trees. We've put an orchard in. We've created food beds with greenhouses. We're putting in raised beds areas, so lots of herbs and vegetables and fruit. Planting lots of really strange trees that you'd think wouldn't really survive in York, like peaches, and I've got a little mini vineyard of putting in. I've also created like a biodiversity wild space and rewilding area as part of this. And it's something that to me, I deal with so many paper writing, the kind of reporting. It's something that's hands-on that gives you real impact and also immediate impact. So
and it's there.
To me,
it's something you can visit. It's like you can go to this thing.
Yeah, and it's something that's it's an exemplar case of looking at that kind of health and well-being benefits. A lot of climate resilience because there's fruit, there's vegetables, there's things that are growing there. It's like having a work allotment essentially. But to me, I'm working through that kind of longer term. So to take a fruit tree, So I've been working with Fruitworks Co-op here in Leeds. I've put in wood that has been recycled from the Leeds Woods Recycles team. We've also looked at how we can kind of embed and expand out the larger community and the benefits to CICs, looking at working with trust conservation volunteers, and all these are groups that are working to make the world a bit of a better place, and lots of different levels, from wood recycling to growing an orchard or growing a fruit tree. And there's the education process that goes with that. So I think there's a lot of benefit of working to support those that are trying to help that structure, and kind of embed community in lots of different ways, through to, you have to write the papers, you have to write the charity cases, you have to write all the stuff to kind of get the money, get the funding, get the people, get the volunteers to do it. So you've got to write the risk assessments and blah, 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 all that type of stuff. But the process of getting there at the end of it is a really critical part of the conversation of how we build a community for the future. So for me, there's an element of that. And as I'm kind of progressing through this, I'm withdrawing a little bit from society, because I can see how much society is destroying itself. So it kind of enlivens me when I go through that process of understanding how we can build a community. Because I've realised actually there are a lot of people that are like me, that working in their sphere, that might be recycling wood, it might be working with mentally disabled people, working with different parts of the community, those that are having mental health problems. And there's lots of different people that are working through the green sphere to kind of help support their systems. So it's hopeful in some ways, because we are still starting to build those communities to kind of support the process going forwards. But it's quite frustrating in other ways, because there's always some bureaucracy to hold you back. But for me, I would, if I was looking at longer term stuff, I can see that the sphere of biodiversity net gain, rewilding, having community engagement within creating green spaces is a really key part of mental health of communities. Not sitting in front of a computer, not writing reports. It's about the outside that we can bring in and help communities to kind of protect themselves in many different ways. That's a big answer for a very short question.
No, that's a really, really good answer. So I don't want to do anything like. So what? I'm thinking how to phrase it now. So, I mean, we talked about early on at the beginning of this. We talked about, when you started this, you went into environmentalism. There wasn't really any sustainability. Like, I mean, people knew about carbon, CO2, but the Carbon Trust, has only been, that was 2005 or something like that. Like, it was this century. It's only fairly recent. Like a lot. And again, we talked in the conversation about momentum, when climate has always seemed to it'll seem to get some momentum in the news, and then something will come along and everyone will get excited about that. And then the oil companies will get everybody distracted again, and it'll calm down, and then some movement will build and momentum will build, and then it subdues. Do you ever look back and appreciate really how massive the size of this is now, like from something that didn't really exist at all in industry to like the amount of places that do have environmental officers, sustainability officers, environmental policies? Like, do you ever think of that? Does it ever? Because I mean, it's not something. So I remember on one of these, I think it was when I was talking to Sale, and them saying, but yet you think back just a few decades, and they didn't have any recycling in offices and so on. But now it's there, and now it's pretty much in every office.
Yeah.
Do we miss the changes? Do we miss some of the good stuff? Are we, do we miss the obvious wins for? Are we always concentrating on the negative, or yeah? Just let you respond to that.
I think we do concentrate on the minutiae sometimes. Um, so the plastic revolution was a little bit of a distraction. I think that the oil industry probably chucked out, just going, oh yeah, we can recycle plastic, we can do this,
Mm,
and that was 2017, and they were distracting you away from the climate agenda, which was a much bigger aspect of, can you recycle the oil? No, you can't. And what can you do with
mm,
plastic? Oh, you can't recycle that really. Um, but at the same time, what as you're saying, we have moved forwards in leaps and bounds, but we have a big mountain to
mm.
climb
Yeah.
to kind of hack climate change down. And there's always been a frisbee of some kind of distraction thrown at us somewhere along the lines. Um, so as you say, yeah, we've gone through the can we get recycling at home? Can we get recycling at um, at work? Can we change the light bulbs? We're still, in some cases, very much the low hanging fruits of where we can be and what we need to be doing. But those are the quick wins. Those are the kind of, well, we could just change the light bulbs and we'll save ourselves
Mm,
60% of our energy costs. Oh, let's do that. That's brilliant. Okay, can we just change our entire fleet to electric vehicles, or could we just change our entire fleet to a set of the things at the end of our legs? Ooh, really difficult. How are we going to mandate that? So there's a lot of stuff that still needs to happen
mm,
um, to shift us away from the harmful stuff. And a lot of it, if we put our positions in sub-Saharan Africa and look at how people survive and work around things, a lot
mm,
of them are doing the same jobs as we are on next to no resources in comparison to it. So the
mm,
art of the possible is there, and we've got the lap of luxury in so many different ways in the UK that we maybe need to take a step back and say, do we need all the crap that we've got? Probably
mm,
don't. Um, do we need to have all the kind of extra stuff that we have? Do we need to demand that we have a holiday that we jet off to every year? No, we don't. But how can we change as all moving forwards on that? It's that's where a lot of the big challenge is. But we're kind of moving to the period now in history that some of these things will just stop and they won't be an option.
mm,
And when you see that oil prices, energy prices, electricity prices might zoom up again this next year,
mm,
how does that affect you personally? What measures do you need to put in place? And do you know what? Some of those measures you need to put in place are going to greener energy, going to a greener vehicle, going to a bike, going to catching the bus.
mm.
And do you know what? You'll save yourself a fortune.
Yeah.
And in many cases, it's viable for everybody. It's not viable for
Yeah.
everybody across the board, but at the same time, there are options that allow you to look at things differently. So I think we all need to start taking our own responsibility, but also we need to push back and say, we want you as big corporates to change. We want you to make my organization greener. I
Mm,
don't care how you do it, just do it. So we
mm,
we we have a voice that we need to use as lobbyists, as walking with our feet somewhere different, and changing the system. And we as the consumers can do that. So yeah, the challenge is there for everybody.
mm. Hmm. Now I'm thinking. Well, I'm thinking of other questions as well. So I'm considering what you're saying and also trying to think of other things. Um, but what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna, I'm gonna leave it there for now. There is I could ask you a whole bunch of things. Um, well, I mean, you've obviously, I mean, you've really imbibed this, and you know, from the years and years of just all of this stuff. So you can tell, like, I mean, and you've got really good recall of the information. You're obviously very, very familiar with it. Um,
I have to
so,
repeat it a lot.
well, yeah. I mean, is that largely just in rooms in organisation? Like, do you do any external media work? Do you guest at other organisations or anything?
Yeah, I mean, even though I work with the ambulance service, I talk to the NHS as a whole on lots of
Mm,
different levels. So we've got the integrated care systems, which stretch across councils, health system, third sector. So I talk to a lot of different people, do a lot of presentations.
mm,
I've also spoken to a variety of different other organisations across the world. So I present quite a lot. So it's it's quite familiar, but also at the same time, it's a bit like living in a recurring nightmare in many cases. That you know that the stuff's coming out of your mouth is true
mm,
because you've seen it, you've got the pictures of it, you've lived through it. It's not a nice place to be sometimes when you talk about climate change,
mm-hmm,
but at the same time, it becomes part of you, and unfortunately, that's the thing. For those that are new into this, which weirdly there's still a lot of people who are just starting to grasp the magnitude of
mm-hmm,
what is coming,
mm,
um, but also they're just starting to grasp the concept of what we can do to change that.
mm,
So you have to repeat it, you have to say it over and over, and those that I train with carbon literacy, the first session is watching David Attenborough's program about climate change, Planet
mm.
Earth, and for many, it's the first time they've seen it, and it's a bit like watching
Yeah,
them being hit repeatedly with a sledgehammer.
yeah.
And you can see them reach the end of the hour, and they're almost in tears. And you think,
How did you not
okay, we
know?
failed.
It's
We
all there.
failed to
It's
not tell
all
you.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, in some cases, it takes the amazing David Attenborough to tell you the horror, um, because you won't listen to anybody else, and
Mm.
and that's maybe what needs to happen. But unfortunately, that's the same thing I've got to do. I've got to watch that program many times.
Well, yeah, and then again, it's that thing between, oh, grow up, deal with it. You're an adult. You have to get on with it and do stuff,
Mm.
and then also going, but look at the size of it.
Yeah,
But look at it. Oh God.
I know.
Uh,
Um, and
so
it's like living through a living horror movie all the time.
yeah, yeah. Well, we are.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
I mean the stuff that happens around it. People wouldn't believe if you wrote it as a script. They'd be like, this is insane. This is nonsense.
I don't know if it should be an 18 rated film.
Oh,
Maybe it
definitely.
should be a 50 or 60 rated film because I don't think anybody really needs to watch these types of things on repeat.
But well, that's it is a communication thing. And again,
Mm,
you kind of, I think you'll find a lot of the work that you're doing here, it is again sort of groundbreaking for want of a better term, but you you know again you're crunching that, like, how do we communicate this? And it has been years of like, we're not communicating this. We're failing. We tell people horror stories and they turn off and they don't want to know because it's too big and it's too overwhelming, and it's coming round to a bit more of a proactive messaging kind of thing now of like, do this, get on with this. um yeah, do you think that's I mean, do you agree with that, first of all, and do you think that's a positive change or a negative change?
I think everybody goes on a journey, and the journey is little steps. Climate change is something you can hit somebody with the sledgehammer of David Attenborough, and they kind of go and hide in a cave, and you'll never see them again. Or
Mm,
some people it spurs into action, but it's a really difficult thing to pitch right because some people just go, oh, you're just regurgitating the same stuff. I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to hear it. But it's a bit like looking at a car crash in slow motion, that if you know you can stop it, why are you not doing that? But for many people, they don't want to kind of get involved because it's not my job. But it is. Do you not live on the same planet as me? I'm not sure. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're
Do you
jetting
like
off in the
eating
universe.
food?
Do you like having a life and
Do
doing
you like
anything?
not burning to death?
Maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah. I mean, for me, when I look at the journey I've been through, I came into the ambulance service. So I spent 3 years driving around the world in an ex-military ambulance. It was a Land Rover Forward Control 101. It had a fuel consumption of about 14 miles to the gallon.
I was
Pretty
going to
rubbish.
say, do you know what your carbon footprint was from it?
Oh, it was. I do. I do.
Thought you might.
Unfortunately. But it was the same fuel consumption as the ambulances that I came into. So this was a 1976 ambulance.
Wow.
I came into the ambulance service and it had exactly the same carbon footprint of 14 miles to the gallon. And I was like, this is shocking. And so I said, right, well, can we not just move over to electric ambulances? Oh, no. This is 2009. And they went, oh, no, we're not going to have electric ambulances because they're milk floats. And in 2009, that was true. Most of them were milk floats. And so there was the journey that I've been through is an element of persuasion. So think 2009, we know we're not having electric. So I went through the process of working with Leeds University to develop a light bar that improves the aerodynamics of the ambulance. And around the same time, which was around 2011, 2012, we moved from having a heavy box body ambulance, which are the square ones that you'll see on the road, to basically a van conversion. And so they went from 14 miles to the gallon to 20 miles to the gallon.
Wow.
Put this light bar on the roof, which Leeds University had done the fluid dynamics and the rest with. And it went from 20 to 21 miles to the gallon, which might not seem huge. It's pretty heavy.
Big. You multiply it across however many ambulances, however many trips, however many days.
We drive 40 million miles a year. So
yeah,
when you start to look at that, that's quite a big impact. And it has had the impact. Yeah. But it's been a slowly catchy monkey on various things like that. So we did lightweighting programs. We took out all the contents of the vehicle, looked at how we could reduce the bulkhead, looking at the design, looking at LED lighting, moving over to alternative different types of fuels, looking at having fuels on our sites, which we hadn't had for quite a while. So you had to go to a petrol station. All these things have kind of contributed to the 14 miles to the gallon to what is now today. We will be having 2 electric ambulances. In 2017, we worked with a company called Ulemco who design hydrogen vehicles, and they designed an electric hydrogen ambulance. So we helped win some funding with that. London Ambulance Service have built it, and that is in existence, and we're looking at test bedding what we could do to get hydrogen electric ones. So the electric ambulance itself has a range of around 100 to 120 miles, which is not great because the downtime for recharging is about 4 or 5 hours. But then when you look at hydrogen one, the hydrogen feeds into creating electricity. The hydrogen takes 5 minutes to refuel. The electric can take 4 to 6 hours to refuel. So essentially, you can get 300 miles in 5 minutes, whereas with just pure electric, you've got 4 to 6 hours to wait to get it recharged back up. Unless you've got a really rapid charging system that may be half an hour to an hour. So we've moved in quite a short space of time from having vehicles that are really quite dreadful fuel efficiency to vehicles that are really quite efficient, and also then moving into vehicles that are zero emission. And essentially, the next step is to not have the vehicles at all. And this might be quite controversial because in reality, the best health system is a health system that is not needed. So having people that are healthy, they're outside, they're green, they're walking places, they're jumping on buses, they're not in cars, they're walking and getting around. They're not sat
at computers all day.
Yeah, So it's how we can shift our health system in a different way, and we're just a very small part, but we're the poster boys of kind of how we can move the whole of the NHS forwards. The ambulance service is the one that's always shown on the front of any kind of problem that happens with the NHS. There's always an ambulance outside of A&E. But we've got the opportunity, I think, to kind of headline the direction we can all go in. And yeah, we're there for anybody that needs us. And that should be the same, having a zero emission vehicle as having a diesel vehicle. So, but we can also, in that route, mean that we have got resilient electricity. We can generate it on site. We're not reliant on Russians or oligarchs somewhere across the planet kind of turning off the taps on our fuel supply. We get our energy from the sun. We can collect it in batteries. We can look at a very different system. And also, we're then resilient to energy shocks, energy price rises, and also looking at how we can keep our own resilience within our stations, but also within our communities, because we can work potentially with smart microgrids and looking at how we can supply into local energy systems. So it's the journey. So taking my fleet manager and my estates team through that, it's a much bigger process. You can start with climate change and they go, yeah, that's going to happen in 2050. That's ages away, blah. But that process of switching over requires policy, requires government change, requires all the different things above us. And that process has meant that we're now 10 years on where we should have been 10 years ago, but the technology has taken that time to catch up with it. So it is a journey that even I've been through that process, but I now understand the urgency of getting these things in place and how at the speed at which we need to do it.
Yeah. You've kind of done the existential crisis and you're now like, right.
Yep. Done.
Crack on then. What can we do?
Yeah. Bit of a challenge.
I mean, does it... I mean, to me, that just really smacks of nothing can get done unless you're paying somebody to do it, unless it's a job. Like, it's not... And especially within a neoliberal context, unless somebody can earn money from it, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, yeah, I think the big change is more people doing your role or roles like it. Of like, you know, that kind of area and sector needs to be as big as the marketing department, and in a way, it needs to be. It needs to be the marketing and training department, and also the head of R&D. It's like, we need to research this. We need to research this.
Yeah, and the thing is, it needs to be in everybody's job description, because what I acknowledged very early on in my career is that I don't know anything about clinical stuff. I'm not a doctor. And I can't change the system. I can't mandate the supply chain of things unless I'm the one making that decision. So some of the kind of revolutions that have happened, and I think the Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg movement helped dramatically. Suddenly, everybody in doctors, anybody in the health system went, oh, do you know what? I could probably get involved in that. But across the board, everybody said, do you know what? I can do that. So for me, I've always struggled with how I can get the clinical engagement. And what happened probably 2020, 2019 was there was a revolution in the anaesthetist sphere. So anaesthesia across the whole of the NHS. So, sorry. To put it in context, the NHS accounts for around 40% of the UK's public sector carbon emissions. So quite huge. And we have to make an impact. So they did the assessment, worked out where all the different carbon hotspots and things were. And they found that around 4% of the carbon emissions were from anaesthesia and analgesics. So looking at things that would knock you out so you can go in for an operation. Analgesics are kind of pain relief like Entonox and things you get in the back of an ambulance, kind of
Yeah.
relieve you of pain on the way to hospital or in A&E. So they worked out, right, oh, wow, what we need to do is we need to reduce our anaesthesia use. And I kind of went, I don't know anything about that. I can't mandate that. And, people that spent many years at university, they're the ones that will do that. And the anaesthetists decided that they would crack on with this. And so this year, they banned desflurane. Now, desflurane has got about 3,000 times the impact of carbon dioxide.
Wow.
So carbon dioxide is one, and desflurane lasts probably about 20 years in the atmosphere. So it carries on doing the same impact as one particle of carbon dioxide 3,000 times more for 20 years.
Yeah.
So a huge impact, and they banned it. And it's taken probably about 3 or 4 years and probably about 20 or 30 years of research to kind of push that agenda forwards. And it's now phased out across the whole of Yorkshire, and we've kind of managed to drive that forward. The anaesthetists have done that, and part of that is them being empowered through the movement to say, well, actually, do you know what? In my job role, I can make that change. Nobody else
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
Procurement teams could say, could you do it? And they go, sod off. No, that's not going to happen.
Mm.
So in reality, it takes you in your job role to make that change, not me. I can say, could you do that? And you go, no. But in reality, you are the one that buys things, looks at things. So you can look at the reusables, look at the renewables, look at the recyclables, whatever it might be, and make that change in whatever sphere you're in. So it could be from a fantastic cleaner up to the chief executive. It could be a doctor, it could be a sustainability lead, it could be a fleet person, it could be anybody across the board. We all have our own little things that we can change. And there will be a huge impact, not just on the cost of buying that product, but also on the waste that's generated, the ocean pollution that comes from cleaning, washing, doing whatever it might be, and washing it into the drainage system. But there'll also be an energy reduction, a shipping reduction, a potentially modern slavery reduction from that product as well. So the impact is huge from just making a little tiny system change. But if you make that change, crow about it, tell everyone, because there's somebody else who is always willing to copy what you've done and make that energy, that financial saving somewhere along the lines.
Or I would say make the change with, find someone that's, simpatico with you, make a change together and sort of do things, because I'm very much into the kind of, I think it all has to be peer led, because there's going to be and any leadership that does arise will come from sort of peer movements and organizations and so on. And I think in a large way, Greta's the first person to kind of personify the movement or the issue as like something that you can put a person on, because that's, how our brains operate, really. Where was I going with this? So I think with peer behavior is going to be a big thing, because we're not going to see that leadership. We're definitely not going to see anything in the big oil-owned media. So it has to be what we see outside. What we see our neighbours doing. If what they're doing in their garden, what cars they're not driving. How often they use the cycle lanes, all of that kind of stuff. And if that appears to work for people, if they feel happier and so on, then that's why you buy in. Everyone wanted blue jeans because they looked cool, and everyone looked like they were having a great time in blue jeans. So if you look like you're having a great time on a bike, then other people will want to do it.
Yeah. And there's the community cohesion that goes with all of it, and having the chat with your neighbours is a really important aspect of how you can move stuff. And I don't think anybody should be ashamed of talking about climate change, and because one of the key elements is listening. So people have their viewpoints about things. Listen to them, talk to them, listen to them, and shut up and let them talk as well, which is the other aspect. I think we all need to understand why people have those viewpoints. And there's some really important lessons to learn from that, because a lot of it, the challenges that we have is about fear, and how we can change society. But most people don't want to change whatever it is that they're clinging on to.
Well, for so many
So,
people, it's losing their livelihoods, like
yeah,
quite literally losing their livelihoods. Like drivers, people who work in buildings that have heating, people
yeah,
who have to get to buildings that have heating, like our food, our holidays, like we mentioned, like entertainment for the kids, or the 8,000 toys that the average child has, or whatever it is. Like it's there, and we're expected to have it, and other people have it, and we're less if we don't have at least what they have, kind of thing.
we all need an IKEA mentality of clean shelves. Yeah, yeah, it is a big problem. It is keeping up with the Joneses that we all need to think about. But keeping up with the Joneses, if the Joneses are the ones that are the new kids on the block that've got solar panels and electric cars and
Just have a
the
better
bikes,
time than the
yeah,
Joneses. Yeah, just
yeah,
sit in the garden, read the newspaper, play a
yeah,
record, do like real physical things, touch grass, have a great time. And as your neighbours are running around stressing, getting all road ragey because they're sitting in traffic, and they come home, eventually they'll be like, I don't want to do that. I want to do what they're doing.
yeah, exactly. Touch grass. That should be that should be the phrase of this one. Touch grass. Yeah, we should. It's engagement with the things that matter. Um, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that's not stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's memories, and it's creating stuff that helps you survive in a different way.
Okay,
Mm.
I know I've only got 5 minutes left in the time slot, but yeah, I'm going to throw it over to you at this point. If there's anything that you want to talk about that we've not talked about, or anything that you want to flag up, or if you want to do socials here, if people want to follow you or find out more, where can they do that? Yeah, so I'll start off with socials or anything that you want to promote, and then if you do want to talk about anything else, we'll just carry on with that.
So if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Alexis Keach, my maiden name, or just look for me under Alexis Percival. You can find a lot of bits and pieces about me on YouTube and under Yorkshire Ambulance Service as well, if you want to read any various different documents and things that are around YouTube videos. And also, if you want to have a listen to some stuff about the face mask project, BBC Radio 4 did an article on it back in 2021. So you'll be able to find that. There's lots of different bits and pieces, and please feel free to drop me a line with any questions, or if you want to contact, or if you want sustainability networks. I'm happy to answer any questions. Even climate deniers, please drop me a line. Don't troll me, please.
Only good faith questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so is there anything else that you want to kind of touch on, or anything that you want to revisit? Or you don't have to, but just to give you the opportunity.
Um, yeah, there's a project that I'm kind of working on at the moment, which is to look at how we can become resilient communities. And what we've realised within the emergency services is we haven't really provided people with the ideas as to what they need to do in order to build their own resilience. So I'll ask the question: do you know what to do in a flood event? Do you know what to do in a heat wave? Do you know what to do in a brownout, a power cut? All of these things are things you need to understand
Mm,
moving into some of the imbalances that we've got with climate change.
mm,
If nothing happens, that's fine. You've got all your documents in one place. You've got your grab bag. You've got all the things that you need. Um, so for me, I think as communities, we need to know how we can move forwards, because these uncertainties are always going to be there, and they have always been there. But if you can understand how you can take your family, your pets, and get out of an emergency situation, it is a really critical part of it. So we have quite a lot of vulnerable people, vulnerable communities in Leeds, and to me, it's a really important question that we all need to ask ourselves: is are we climate ready? And the answer for most of us is no.
Nope.
You know, so how can we work through what we can do with that? In California, they have different grab bags. So they have wildfire grab bags, they've got heat wave grab bags, they've got flood grab bags, and they have their evacuation routes to escape through. In the Caribbean, they've all got evacuation routes because they've got a lot of volcanoes, and they also get hit by a lot of tsunamis. We don't have those natural disasters as much, but more and more of them are kind of coming towards us. So part of that is how, check on your neighbours in a heat wave. There may be an old lady or an old gentleman that needs some help through that period, that just needs somebody to come and say, come outside, cool down a bit, let's go for a walk, have some water. But it's about how we kind of build that community resilience as well. You might not be in a flood zone, but have a look at what you can do, because the reality is we all travel through flood zones. We all travel to flood zones.
Yep.
We work there. We go on tourist trips out. Do you know what to do in the event of whatever that might be? So
I
we
think the
need
answer
to kind of
to
look
that
at
is
that.
complain to your rep.
Well, obviously, yes, they'll be able to turn the wildfire off.
I don't know what to do.
Get me off this island immediately. Well, you mean there's
I'm
no
going
aeroplanes
to
coming
write a
in?
very stern letter to the manager about this.
Yeah, so it's just about building our own world that we want as well, and the climate resilience is part of that. But also, we've got an opportunity now to look at how we as Leeds build our own society. And there's a lot of donut economics that Kate Raworth is looking at, building the realms of what we need. There's the Northern Forest and the White Rose Forest, looking at how we can get trees in. We've got trees for cities, so they're planting trees on roadside, curbsides. We've got smart microgrids going in place. We've got climate action leads are looking at what we can do to kind of build that society that we all want. And lots of different parts of Leeds have got action projects. Get involved. Plant a local community orchard. Get involved with rewilding projects. Go and find your local community groups. But also, you can do your own action. You can do, number one, go and have a look at your energy bill. See whether you're with a renewable energy supplier as a starting point. But also look at what you can do to build your own stuff into place. So look at air source heat pumps if you can afford it. There are systems in place to kind of build it up so it doesn't cost you an absolute arm and a leg. Get solar panels put in. And if you can't, there's ways you can buy into local community systems that enable you to kind of do that as well. So I think we all have our own parts to play. But at the same time, the biggest impact is if you're working, get out there, talk to your boss, work out what you can do, and get the system changed from within, because that's where the biggest impact is. And then lots of things will come out of that, lots of connections, lots of community and work support. There are people out there that are crying out for help and support in lots of different areas. And some of it is just about understanding how to navigate the way through everything that's going on.
I've got one quick question before I close this off. So, because I've spoken to quite a few artists and writers and stuff as I've been doing this, and obviously with the climate stuff, and we've touched upon sort of artist responsibility and what artists can do in terms of climate and so on, and in terms of creating visions of the future and realistic visions and so on, and these things kind of coming about. So you gave a lot of very practical examples there. What do you think are the kind of like the soft power side of stuff? Like, are you very much focused on the practical, or does that sort of is that part of your thinking as well, the kind of more visionary stuff?
So, what do you mean by soft?
Well, I guess you know, the imagery, the martyrs, the paintings on the wall,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
they're the kind of, this is the good way, this is the way to live, this is how we do live. You know, like, if you look at recent science fiction, especially in film, it's very much just dystopia, dystopia, dystopia. Like, what are the, like, it? I think it's up to artists now to, and I think you're starting to see some of this, to create the kind of visions, not just of like a utopia, but like, how do we live with this? Like, how do we actually live with this? Does it all just mean that we're all going to be barcoded, or does it mean something a bit more, you know, something more like how we have things, but different? It's hard to talk about because we haven't got the material to talk about. It's one of those things. It's kind of like when I started this, and they do all that in the marketing material. They're like, "Oh, imagine your perfect listener or customer or whatever." It's like, I don't know because I haven't done it. So,
Yeah.
God knows.
I, I mean, when you talk about the dystopia or the utopia, we do have two visions, and anybody who's talking about climate change is predominantly talking about the dystopia.
Mm,
But we're not talking about Waterworld. We're talking about Waterworld maybe a couple of months of the year type of thing. So I think if we're trying to be visionary for a climate change future, if we're looking at 2050, and there's some fantastic digital aids that are around, a couple of games that kind of say, well, okay,
mm,
if my vision is this, this is what we'll end up with. So there's a couple of digital platforms that basically will take you. Okay, I choose my vision, my political ideas, my I would like that to happen or this to happen,
mm,
and you choose particular scenarios, and as a society you move through, and one might lead you to dystopia and one might lead you to near utopia. And those kind of give you that kind of, this is what the trajectory is we're on, but it's a kind of news headline, the Sun versus a Telegraph or a Guardian type of headlines.
mm,
Um, I think if it's so, I think one of the problems with climate change is, as we're talking about visions, everybody's vision of what the future might be is, well, it's no different to now.
mm,
There might be it's a bit warmer, um, and if you're talking to a town planner, their vision is potentially we're going to have a solar panels on every building, we're going to have
mm,
wind turbines here, and we're going to have high-rise buildings that are covered in green trees and all the rest of the stuff. Is that real? I mean, we live in a Victorian city here in Leeds. Most of the buildings we've got now will probably still be standing, even if they're underwater, in 80 years' time. And we will have adapted them slightly, but people don't really like changing the facades of buildings, and we're not going to coat everything in plaster to kind of beat off heat waves and all the rest of things. We
mm,
we need to kind of build within the concepts of what we've got, I think.
mm,
And so if we start to look at Leeds going forwards, what do we want it to be? And a lot of it will be behind the scenes. It'll be inside of our houses. We'll have insulated. We will have modernised, changed, knocked through walls, built new extensions, put solar panels on. But it won't be, we've not wiped out entire neighbourhoods.
mm,
Or maybe we have. I don't know. And that's maybe the things we need to start to visualise is, okay, the river's going to come through this bit. We don't have any choice. How do we clear this area? How do we build differently? Do we build again? What's our population going to be like? And that's the thing. If we've got potential for new pandemics that might come, and that this is, I say pontification, but it's a kind of, we need to visualize.
mm,
So when we talk about the tipping points, the challenges that we've got is if we start to warm our world and we melt our glaciers and we melt ice caps and the various poles, we start to have permafrost that defrosts, and we are ending up with species and viruses and things that have been buried for tens of thousands of years that suddenly start to defrost. We're opening up our world to more pandemics, because basically there was a case 2 years ago where a little boy had wandered around the Mongolian steppe, and he found a reindeer, and the reindeer had anthrax. He brought the anthrax home, and the entire family was wiped out. That reindeer had been dead for 10,000 years. And they then discovered that some of the other species that were in the permafrost they reactivated them. They'd been dead for been frozen for over 100,000 years. So as we kind of move into the realms of warmer environments, we might need to think about those pandemics, those viruses, those things that will hit us, that might change our cities, our towns, our country completely, because there might not be people. So that's the dystopian end. The utopian end is we have a cohesive society. We are self-sufficient. We can cope with the amount of rain. We can cope with the heat waves. We've got green spaces. We've got a lot more trees. We don't all have to travel to an office. We live within our means. But all of these things are not written down. So we've got the opportunity now to shape it. So if you start to visualize things, and people's brains work differently when you're talking about climate change in the future. So sometimes you chuck numbers at people, you chuck statistics, you chuck visual aspects, pictures of starving polar bears, people hugging trees, lots of different things. And then if you're trying to ask them to look at the future, there's nothing. There is no idea as to what that future looks like for some. Talk to an 8-year-old, they'll tell you what they think their future is going to look like. And it's very different to how mine is. So maybe we need to get them to write our future, because hopefully that's where it's going to be. It is a difficult one. I think we do need to visualize the apocalyptic versus the perfect. And hopefully we can get something in the middle, but who knows?
We will find out, as I say in the introduction.
It'll be a Victorian Leeds, I think.
Well, I think we're very well placed. I think we're doing a lot. There's a lot going on here, and I think this is the time and place. Leeds is rising again.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to stop the recording there. I will thank you on the recording. Thank you very much for doing this. As I said, don't go anywhere just yet. Thank you again to Alexis for the interview. Thanks, as always, to all my guests, and thanks to you, Leeds, for being my subject. If you're in Leeds or from Leeds, if you are Leeds, then please come on this show. Yes, I am speaking to you. I still need to find 892 loiners to interview, so being a guest is the greatest help. You will enjoy it. Remember to like, share, follow, and subscribe to Working Hours, and please consider supporting Working Hours financially with either a regular or a one-off donation of any amount, either via Ko-fi or patreon.com. You can email Working Hours at workinghourspod@western-studios.com. Okay, that's me. Work for peace and plan with kindness. Cheers, ears. Take care out there and be kind to each other, Leeds. Working Hours is produced, recorded, edited and published by Simon Treen for Western Studios Leeds Limited. The music was The Bees from Chopin's Etudes, which is in the public domain and was taken from museopen.org. Follow Western Studios Leeds on Facebook at facebook.com/western_studios_Leeds and on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/western-studios. Western Studios Leeds will help you realise your podcast for only £25 for an hour of podcast work. Need podcast production, recording, editing, or any podcast admin doing? Need it all doing? Do you want or need a podcast host or co-host for your podcast project? Then get in touch with Western Studios Leeds Limited. Email makemypodcast@western-studios.com to get your podcast made. I am available to third sector organisations, small to medium-sized businesses and individuals who want to make podcasts or create other digital audio content. Want to make some fundraising case studies? Want to show off your expertise in your field? Want some help creating your show and format, or just some support learning to podcast and getting going? Whatever your podcast needs, get in touch with Western Studios Leeds. Go to western-studios.com and use the contact page to drop me a message about either working hours or about your own podcast project.